I never thought a bag of ice melt would turn my life into a legal nightmare. But here I was, holding a $300 fine from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, while staring at the very substance that had gotten me into this mess. My name is Harrison Cole, and I had been living in this cookie-cutter development in suburban Michigan for about 2 years. The place seemed nice enough when I moved in. Clean streets, well-maintained common areas, and neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. What I didn't realize was that the HOA board, specifically its president, a woman named Patricia Henderson, ran the place like her personal fiefdom. It was early January, and Michigan winters were no joke. The temperatures had been hovering around 15 degrees for the past week, and the forecast called for an ice storm. I had gone to Home Depot on a Tuesday afternoon and bought 4 bags of ice melt, along with a new snow shovel since my old one had cracked. I was prepared for the worst, and as someone who worked from home as a software developer, I needed to make sure I could at least get to my car if I had to go anywhere in an emergency. When I got home, I carried the bags from my truck to my front porch. My garage was full of boxes I still hadn't unpacked from the move, and I figured I would reorganize it this weekend. For now, I stacked the bags neatly against the wall next to my front door, right under the overhang where they would stay dry. They looked fine there, honestly. The bags were a uniform gray color with blue lettering, stacked 2 by 2, taking up maybe 3 square feet of space. I went inside, made myself dinner, and didn't think anything of it. That was my first mistake. The next morning, I woke up to find an envelope stuck to my front door. It was one of those official HOA violation notices, the ones printed on their letterhead with the community logo and everything. I opened it right there on my porch, still in my pajamas and robe, my breath making clouds in the freezing air. The notice stated that I was in violation of Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines, which prohibited unsightly storage of materials visible from the street or common areas. The fine was $300, payable within 30 days. There was also a stern warning that if I did not remove the offending items immediately, I would face additional daily fines of $50. I looked at the bags of ice melt. Unsightly. They were literally bags of salt that every single person in Michigan needed during winter. I looked around the neighborhood. 2 houses down, the Petersons had a rusted barbecue grill sitting on their porch that had been there since summer. Across the street, someone had a decorative scarecrow that was now just a sad, weather-beaten lump leaning against their mailbox. But my ice melt, neatly stacked and actually useful, was the problem. I went inside and immediately called the HOA office. A pleasant-sounding woman named Denise answered. "Hi, this is Harrison Cole from 247 Maple Drive. I just received a violation notice about ice melt on my porch, and I think there has been some kind of mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "Oh, let me pull up your file," Denise said. I could hear typing in the background. "Yes, Mr. Cole." The violation was submitted yesterday evening by Mrs. Henderson during her neighborhood inspection. She noted that you have multiple bags of what appears to be commercial salt or ice melt stored in a visible location. Right, but it is just ice melt, for the driveway. Because of the ice storm coming. Everyone has this stuff, I said. I understand, Mr. Cole, but the guidelines are very clear about visible storage. Items like that need to be kept in a garage or shed where they are not visible from the street, Denise explained, her tone sympathetic but firm. My garage is full right now. I am planning to organize it this weekend. Can I just get a few days extension? I will have it moved by Sunday, I offered. I am sorry, but Mrs. Henderson has already processed the violation. You would need to appeal it at the next board meeting, which is scheduled for the last Wednesday of the month. In the meantime, the fine stands, and you do need to remove the items to avoid additional penalties. I felt my frustration building. So I have to pay $300 because I prepared for an ice storm. You can present your case at the meeting, Mr. Cole. I really am sorry. I don't make these rules, Denise said, and I could tell she genuinely felt bad about it. I thanked her and hung up. Then I went outside, grabbed all 4 bags of ice melt and hauled them into my house. I stacked them in my entryway closet, barely managing to fit them around my coats and shoes. It was absurd. The ice storm hit that night. It was one of those freezing rain situations that coats everything in a thick layer of ice. By Thursday morning, the entire neighborhood looked like a skating rink. I got up early and used 2 of my bags to salt my driveway and the walkway leading to my front door. The ice melt worked beautifully, creating safe, clear paths while everything around remained dangerously slick. I had a video call scheduled for 9 in the morning with a client in California, so I set up my laptop and got to work. Around 10:30, I took a break to refill my coffee. That was when I heard the commotion outside. I looked out my window and saw an ambulance pulling into the neighborhood. It headed toward the community center, a building located at the front of our development that housed the HOA office, a small gym, and a meeting room. Curious, I grabbed my coat and walked down the street. Several other neighbors had the same idea. When I got there, I saw 2 paramedics carefully loading someone onto a stretcher. That someone was Patricia Henderson. Even from a distance, I could see she was in pain, clutching her left leg while one of the paramedics secured straps around her. Her face was pale, and she was talking rapidly to a man standing nearby, who I recognized as Gerald, the vice president of the HOA board. The community center had a set of 5 concrete steps leading up to the main entrance. Every single one of them was coated in ice. There was no salt, no sand, nothing. Just pure, slick, treacherous ice. What happened? I asked Mrs. Chen, an older woman who lived a few houses down from me. Patricia slipped on the steps, she said, shaking her head. She came in for office hours this morning and went right down. I heard she might have broken her ankle. I looked at the steps again, then at Patricia being loaded into the ambulance. The irony was not lost on me. The woman who had fined me for storing ice melt, the very substance that could have prevented this exact situation, had just injured herself because no one had properly treated the icy steps at the building she was responsible for maintaining. Gerald was now talking to one of the paramedics, nodding seriously. The ambulance doors closed and it pulled away, lights flashing but no sirens. Gerald turned and started walking back toward the building. I caught his eye. Gerald, those steps are really dangerous. Does the HOA have ice melt to put down? I called out. He looked at me, then at the steps, then back at me. I don't know. Patricia usually handles that kind of thing. I will check the storage room. I have extra if you need it, I offered, despite my irritation with the whole situation. That would be great, thanks, Gerald said, looking genuinely relieved. I went back home, grabbed one of my remaining bags of ice melt and hauled it back to the community center. Gerald met me at the bottom of the steps, carefully navigating the ice. Thanks for this, Harrison. I really appreciate it, he said, taking the bag from me. No problem. Just trying to keep people safe, I said pointedly. Gerald caught my tone. Is everything okay? Well, I got fined $300 2 days ago for having bags of ice melt on my porch. This exact product that could have prevented Patricia's fall this morning, I said, gesturing to the bag in his hands. Gerald's expression shifted to something between embarrassment and concern. Oh, I did not realize. That does seem a bit excessive. A bit, I agreed. I am planning to appeal it at the next board meeting. You should definitely do that, Gerald said. Look, I need to get this down on the steps before someone else gets hurt, but we will talk about this, okay? I nodded and headed home. The rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Patricia Henderson, in her zealous enforcement of the HOA rules, had created a situation where she herself had gotten hurt. If she had been less concerned about the appearance of ice melt on my porch and more concerned about actually using it where it was needed, she would be fine right now. Over the next few days, news spread through the neighborhood. Patricia had indeed broken her ankle. She would be out for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. Gerald had taken over her duties temporarily, and to his credit, one of his first acts was to have the maintenance company treat all the common areas with ice melt. The community center steps were now clear and safe. I decided to do some research. I pulled up the HOA guidelines and read through Section 4.7 in detail. The language was vague, talking about unsightly storage and materials that detract from the aesthetic appeal of the community. There was no specific mention of ice melt, salt, or any winter maintenance supplies. In fact, there was a whole separate section about snow removal requirements that mandated homeowners keep their walkways clear and safe during winter months. The hypocrisy was stunning. I also checked Michigan state law regarding HOAs. I learned that HOA fines had to be reasonable, and that homeowners had the right to appeal any violation before being required to pay. The notice I had received made it sound like the fine was already set in stone, but legally, I had the right to a hearing first. Armed with this information, I drafted a formal appeal letter. I kept it professional but firm. I pointed out the vague language in the guidelines, the fact that ice melt was a seasonal necessity for safety compliance, and the apparent selective enforcement given other items I had observed in the neighborhood. I also noted that Patricia's accident demonstrated the importance of having ice melt readily accessible. I didn't mention her by name in that context, but the implication was clear. I submitted my appeal letter to the HOA office, providing copies via email and certified mail. Denise confirmed receipt and told me I would be scheduled to present my case at the January board meeting. The weeks leading up to the meeting were tense. I continued my work, venturing out only when necessary. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal as the ice melted and temperatures fluctuated. I saw Patricia once, through her front window, hobbling around on crutches. I didn't feel good about her injury, but I also didn't feel particularly sympathetic given the circumstances. A few days before the meeting, I ran into Gerald at the grocery store. We ended up in the same checkout line. "Hey, Harrison, looking forward to the meeting?" he asked, his tone suggesting he knew it was going to be interesting. "As much as anyone looks forward to these things," I said. "How is Patricia doing?" "She is recovering. Pretty frustrated about being laid up, as you can imagine." "She is planning to attend the meeting remotely," Gerald said. "That should be fun," I muttered. Gerald gave me a sympathetic look. "For what it is worth, I have been reviewing the guidelines and I think you have a valid point. The rules are meant to maintain property values and community standards, not punish people for being prepared for winter weather." "I appreciate that," I said, genuinely surprised by his candor. "Just present your case clearly at the meeting. The board will listen," Gerald said. The meeting was scheduled for 7 in the evening on the last Wednesday of January. I arrived at the community center at 6:45, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks. I wanted to look professional and serious. The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs for residents. A projector screen was set up on one side, presumably for Patricia to join via video call. Other residents trickled in. I recognized some faces, though I didn't know most of their names. The HOA board consisted of 5 members: Patricia as president, Gerald as vice president, a woman named Susan who was the treasurer, a man named Robert who was the secretary, and another woman named Karen who was a general board member. The irony of having an actual Karen on the HOA board was not lost on me. At 7 sharp, Gerald called the meeting to order. The projector flickered to life, and there was Patricia, sitting in what looked like her living room, her crutches visible leaning against the wall behind her. She looked tired and irritated. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have several items on the agenda, including budget updates, landscaping proposals, and resident appeals. Let us begin with the budget," Gerald said. The first 40 minutes of the meeting were excruciatingly boring. Susan walked through various line items, discussing snow removal costs, insurance premiums, and reserve fund allocations. I tried to pay attention, but my mind kept drifting to my upcoming appeal. Finally, Gerald said, "Next, we have resident appeals. Harrison Cole has submitted an appeal regarding a violation notice for visible storage of ice melt. Harrison, would you like to present your case?" I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I had printed copies of my appeal letter, photos of the ice melt on my porch, photos of other items around the neighborhood, and relevant sections of the HOA guidelines and Michigan state law. I handed the packets to each board member. "Thank you for the opportunity to present my appeal," I began. On January 7th, I received a violation notice and a $300 fine for storing 4 bags of ice melt on my front porch. I had purchased these bags in preparation for the forecasted ice storm, and I had them on my porch temporarily while I organized my garage. The notice cited Section 4.7 of the Community Guidelines regarding unsightly storage. I paused and looked at the board members. They were all looking at the materials I had provided. I believe this violation was issued in error for several reasons. First, the language in Section 4.7 is vague and does not specifically prohibit winter maintenance supplies. Second, ice melt is a necessary safety item, particularly during Michigan winters, and the guidelines actually require homeowners to maintain clear and safe walkways. Third, there appears to be selective enforcement, as evidenced by the photos I have provided showing other items in the neighborhood that could be considered unsightly, but have not been cited. And fourth, the fine was issued without an opportunity for me to respond or correct the alleged violation, which is contrary to Michigan HOA law that requires notice and an opportunity to cure before penalties are imposed. I could see Patricia on the screen, her expression hardening. She unmuted herself. "Mr. Cole, the guidelines are clear. Visible storage of materials that detract from the community's appearance is prohibited. Your porch is highly visible from the street, and those bags were an eyesore," she said, her voice sharp despite her injury. "With all due respect, Mrs. Henderson, ice melt is a temporary seasonal item that serves a critical safety function. It is not the same as leaving out trash cans or storing junk. And as we saw firsthand, the absence of properly applied ice melt can result in serious injury," I said, carefully measuring my words. The room got very quiet. Patricia's face flushed red on the screen. "Are you suggesting that my accident was somehow related to this violation?" she snapped. "I am suggesting that prioritizing appearance over safety is misguided. If having ice melt readily accessible is considered unsightly, then we are sending the wrong message about what is important in this community," I said calmly. Gerald cleared his throat. I think Harrison makes some valid points. The guidelines do need to balance aesthetic concerns with practical safety needs, especially during winter. And I do think we need to be more consistent in how we enforce these rules. Susan, the treasurer, nodded. I agree. I have bags of ice melt in my garage right now, and if my garage had been full, I might have put them on my porch too. $300 seems excessive for something like this. Karen, the board member, spoke up. But we can't just ignore the guidelines. If we let people store whatever they want on their porches, the neighborhood will look cluttered and property values will decline. I am not suggesting we ignore the guidelines, I countered. I am suggesting we apply them reasonably. A temporary storage of ice melt during an ice storm is different from permanently leaving out old furniture or appliances. And I am also pointing out that the fine was issued without giving me any warning or chance to move the items, which is legally problematic. Robert, the secretary, had been quiet until now. He flipped through the papers I had provided. Harrison is correct about the legal requirement for notice. We are supposed to give homeowners a written warning and a reasonable time to cure violations before imposing fines. Did he receive a warning first, Patricia? Patricia looked uncomfortable. The severity of the visual impact warranted immediate action. Those bags were right there in plain view. That is not how the process is supposed to work, Robert said firmly. We have to follow proper procedure, even when we think a violation is clear-cut. The board members began discussing among themselves, sometimes forgetting to mute the conversation. I stood there, waiting, feeling increasingly confident that this was going to go my way. After about 5 minutes of discussion, Gerald addressed me. Harrison, thank you for your presentation. The board needs to deliberate. If you could please take a seat, we will have a decision shortly. I returned to my seat. The board continued talking, their voices low. Patricia was clearly unhappy, gesturing emphatically on the screen. Gerald remained calm, playing mediator. Susan and Robert seemed to be on my side. Karen looked torn. Finally, Gerald called for a vote. All in favor of upholding the violation and fine, raise your hand. Patricia raised her hand on the screen. Karen hesitated, then did not raise her hand. All in favor of overturning the violation and fine. Gerald, Susan, Robert, and Karen all raised their hands. The appeal is sustained. The violation is rescinded and no fine will be assessed, Gerald announced. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had won. However, Gerald continued, we do need to address the broader issue. I propose that we form a committee to review Section 4.7 and provide clearer guidance on what constitutes prohibited storage, with specific exceptions for seasonal safety items. Are there any volunteers? A few hands went up, including mine. Gerald noted the volunteers and said the committee would meet in February. Patricia abruptly left the video call. Her screen went black. The meeting wrapped up shortly after that. As people filed out, several neighbors came up to me to offer congratulations or share their own HOA horror stories. Gerald approached me as I was gathering my things. Good job tonight, Harrison. You made a solid case, he said, extending his hand. I shook it. Thanks. I appreciate you being fair about this. It is the right thing to do. And honestly, Patricia's accident was a wake-up call. We need to focus more on substance and less on appearances, Gerald said. Over the next few weeks, things settled down. The committee met twice, and we drafted new language for Section 4.7 that explicitly allowed for temporary storage of seasonal items like ice melt, snow shovels, and holiday decorations, provided they were stored neatly and removed within a reasonable time after the season ended. The revised guidelines would be voted on at the next board meeting. Patricia returned to her HOA duties in late February, still moving slowly but no longer on crutches. I saw her at the March board meeting, where the revised guidelines were approved unanimously. She was cordial but distant, clearly still smarting from the whole situation. One Saturday in early March, I was outside washing my car when Patricia pulled up in her SUV. She got out, walked over to my driveway, and stood there for a moment, as if gathering her courage. "Harrison, do you have a minute?" she asked. "Sure," I said, turning off the hose. She took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize. I was overly rigid in enforcing the guidelines, and I let my focus on appearances cloud my judgment. You were right. Ice melt is important, and I should have approached the situation differently." I was genuinely surprised. "I appreciate that, Patricia. That takes a lot to admit." "My accident was humbling," she said with a rueful smile. Lying there on those steps, in pain, knowing that we should have salted them but did not because I had been too busy writing violation notices for things that did not really matter. It put things in perspective. "I am glad you are recovering well," I said sincerely. "Thank you. And thank you for the ice melt you gave Gerald that day. He used it on the steps, and it probably prevented other people from getting hurt," she said. "You are welcome," I said. She nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "For what it is worth, I voted against your appeal because I did not want to admit I was wrong in front of everyone, but I am glad the board overturned it. You did not deserve that fine." "Water under the bridge," I said. She smiled, a genuine one this time, and walked back to her car. After that conversation, things in Meadowbrook Estates improved considerably. Patricia was less aggressive in her enforcement, focusing on actual problems like overgrown lawns or abandoned vehicles rather than minor aesthetic issues. The new guidelines gave homeowners more flexibility while still maintaining community standards. And every time it snowed or iced over, I made sure to have my bags of ice melt ready, stored neatly in my now organized garage, but readily accessible when needed. The community center steps were always well salted after that incident. Gerald made it a priority, and the maintenance company was given clear instructions to treat all common areas at the first sign of winter weather. No one else slipped and fell. In April, the HOA held its annual meeting and elections for the board. Patricia chose not to run for president again, citing her desire to step back and focus on other priorities. Gerald was elected president, and he appointed me to fill the vacant board position. I accepted, figuring that being on the inside would give me a better chance to prevent future situations like the ice melt debacle. My first board meeting as an official member was both enlightening and frustrating. I quickly learned that running an HOA involved a lot more work than I had realized. There were constant complaints from residents, vendors to manage, budgets to balance, and endless minor disputes to mediate. But I also saw opportunities to make positive changes. One of my first initiatives was to create a clearer violation process. We drafted a new policy that required all violations to go through a 3-step process. First, a friendly notice informing the homeowner of the issue and asking them to address it within a reasonable time frame. Second, a formal written warning if the issue was not resolved. And third, a fine only if the homeowner refused to comply after multiple attempts at communication. We also capped fines at $100 for minor violations and required board approval for anything higher. The new policy was popular with residents. People appreciated being treated with respect rather than immediately hit with punitive fines. Compliance actually improved because homeowners felt like they were being given a fair chance to address problems. I also pushed for more transparency in how the HOA operated. We started publishing detailed minutes from board meetings, including how each member voted on major decisions. We created an online portal where residents could submit maintenance requests, check their account status, and access community documents. These changes made the HOA feel less like an authoritarian regime and more like an actual community organization. Through all of this, my relationship with Patricia remained cordial. She attended board meetings as a resident and occasionally offered insights based on her years of experience. She had genuinely learned from her accident and was less rigid in her thinking. We would never be close friends, but there was mutual respect. In June, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue at my house. I had finally unpacked all those boxes in my garage and had room for my grill and outdoor furniture. About 20 neighbors showed up, including Gerald, Susan, Robert, and even Patricia. We ate burgers and hot dogs, drank beer, and talked about everything except HOA business. It was nice. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, Gerald pulled me aside. "You have done a really good job on the board, Harrison. You brought a fresh perspective that we needed," he said. "Thanks. I just try to think about what would be fair if I were on the other side of a violation notice," I said. "That is exactly the right approach." Patricia was not a bad person, but she got too caught up in the power of the position. "It happens more often than you would think with HOAs," Gerald said. "I can see how it would. It is easy to forget that these are people's homes, not just properties to be managed," I said. "Exactly. Keep that mindset and you will do great," Gerald said, clapping me on the shoulder. Summer passed peacefully. The neighborhood looked great, everyone was getting along, and the HOA was functioning smoothly. I continued my work as a software developer, now taking occasional breaks to handle HOA emails or calls. It was manageable, and I found the work surprisingly rewarding when it involved actually helping people rather than just enforcing arbitrary rules. In September, we had our first real test of the new violation process. A homeowner had started a home business doing car repairs and had several vehicles in various states of disassembly in his driveway. This was a legitimate aesthetic and safety concern, as the cars were leaking fluids and attracting complaints from neighbors. Following our new process, we sent a friendly notice explaining the concern and asking him to move the cars to a more appropriate location, or at least reduce the number of vehicles visible from the street. He responded angrily, claiming we were harassing him and that he had a right to run his business from his home. We sent a formal written warning, citing the specific guidelines that prohibited commercial activities that created nuisances or safety hazards. We also offered to work with him to find a compromise, such as allowing one project car at a time if it was kept in the garage with the door closed. He ignored the warning. The complaints from neighbors increased. We had no choice but to issue a fine and inform him that continued non-compliance could result in legal action. That got his attention. He contacted me directly, and we had a long phone conversation. He explained that he had recently lost his job and was trying to make ends meet by doing repairs on the side. He understood the neighbors' concerns, but felt trapped between financial necessity and community rules. I worked with him to find a solution. We agreed that he could continue his business if he rented a small garage space nearby and kept his driveway clear of project cars. The HOA even agreed to waive the fine if he complied within 30 days. He took the deal, rented a space at a local storage facility that had garage units, and moved all his project cars there. The neighbors were happy. He kept his income source, and we avoided an ugly legal battle. This situation reinforced my belief that most HOA problems could be solved with communication and a willingness to find reasonable compromises. Not every issue needed to be a battle. As fall turned to winter, Michigan's weather once again became a concern. I smiled every time I saw my ice melt bags, now prominently stored in my garage right next to the door for easy access. When the first snow fell in November, I was ready. I salted my driveway and walkway, and then I grabbed an extra bag and walked over to the community center. The maintenance company had already treated the steps, but I left the bag by the door with a note: emergency backup supply. Use as needed. Gerald saw it later that day and sent me a text. "You are a good man, Harrison. Thank you." In December, we held our holiday party at the community center. It was a potluck event, and nearly half the neighborhood showed up. There was a festive atmosphere with decorations, music, and plenty of food. Patricia was there, laughing and chatting with neighbors like any other resident. At one point, she came over to where I was standing by the punch bowl. "This is nice," she said, gesturing at the crowded room. "I do not remember our holiday parties being this well attended when I was president. People like feeling like they are part of a community, not just subjects of a board," I said, then immediately regretted my bluntness. But Patricia just laughed. "You are absolutely right. I wish I had figured that out sooner." "It is never too late to learn," I said. "True," she agreed, then added, "I never properly thanked you for how you handled that situation last winter. You could have been vindictive or made a big public thing about my accident, but you did not. You stayed classy." "It was not about revenge. It was about fixing a problem," I said. "And you did. This community is better now because you stood up for what was right," Patricia said. We clinked our punch cups together in an informal toast, and then she wandered off to join another conversation. I stood there, reflecting on the past year. It had started with a ridiculous $300 fine over ice melt, and had led to me joining the HOA board and helping to reform how the community operated. Life was strange sometimes. The party continued late into the evening. Kids ran around playing games while adults talked and laughed. It felt like a real community, something that had been missing before. As I helped clean up afterward, I realized that this was what an HOA was supposed to be about: bringing people together, maintaining shared spaces, and making the neighborhood a better place to live. It was not about petty enforcement of arbitrary rules or power trips by board members. January came around again, marking 1 year since the ice melt incident. Michigan delivered another ice storm, almost like clockwork. I was prepared, as was everyone else. The entire neighborhood seemed to have stockpiles of ice melt now, and driveways and walkways were quickly treated. The community center steps were cleared within an hour of the storm ending. At the January board meeting, we reviewed the past year's accomplishments. Violation notices were down by 60%, but actual compliance was up. Resident satisfaction, as measured by an anonymous survey we had conducted, was at an all-time high. The budget was balanced, and we even had a small surplus that we voted to invest in new playground equipment for the common area. "I want to thank everyone on the board for their hard work this year," Gerald said as we wrapped up the meeting. "And I especially want to acknowledge Harrison for bringing a fresh perspective and helping us become a better HOA. Sometimes it takes an outsider to point out when we have lost our way." The other board members applauded, and I felt a genuine sense of pride. What had started as a frustrating confrontation over ice melt had turned into an opportunity to make real positive change. After the meeting, I drove home through the cold January night. The streets were clear, the salt trucks having made their rounds. Lights glowed warmly from house windows. It looked like a postcard of suburban winter life. I pulled into my driveway, noticing that my walkway could use another application of ice melt. I went into my garage, grabbed a bag, and spent 10 minutes spreading it evenly across the concrete. The crystals crunched under my boots, and I could already see them starting to work, melting through the thin layer of ice that had formed. As I put the bag away, I thought about Patricia's fall on those icy steps a year ago. It had been a painful lesson for her, literally and figuratively. But it had also been a catalyst for change. Sometimes people needed to experience the consequences of their own rigid thinking before they could see things differently. I went inside, made myself a cup of hot chocolate, and settled onto my couch. My phone buzzed with a text from Gerald. "Great meeting tonight. Glad to have you on the team." I smiled and replied, "Glad to be here. Who knew ice melt could lead to all this?" He sent back a laughing emoji and, "Life works in mysterious ways." Indeed it did. A year ago, I had been furious about an unjust fine, worried about fighting a faceless bureaucracy, and frustrated with the pettiness of HOA politics. Now, I was part of that system, working from the inside to make it better. I had learned that most people, even difficult ones like Patricia, were not truly bad. They were just stuck in patterns of thinking that needed to be challenged. The ice melt incident had taught me several valuable lessons. First, standing up for yourself was important, even when it felt uncomfortable. If I had just paid that $300 fine without question, nothing would have changed. Second, most conflicts could be resolved through respectful dialogue and a willingness to find common ground. And third, sometimes the universe had a sense of irony so perfect that you just had to laugh at it. Over the following months, life in Meadowbrook Estates continued to improve. We implemented more changes based on resident feedback, updating the playground equipment as planned, improving lighting in the common areas, and starting a neighborhood watch program that brought people together for safety rather than surveillance. In March, we had our annual elections again. Gerald ran unopposed for president and won easily. I was re-elected to my board position, along with Susan and Robert. Karen chose not to run again, citing time commitments from her job. 2 new members joined the board, both bringing fresh energy and ideas. Patricia attended the meeting and announced that she and her husband were moving to Florida. Her ankle had never fully healed, and she wanted to live somewhere without brutal winters. She thanked the community for the years she had spent there and wished everyone well. There was genuine applause, and several people went up to hug her afterward. Whatever resentment people might have held toward her strict leadership style had faded. As the meeting ended and people filed out, Patricia came over to me one last time. "Harrison, I want you to have this," she said, handing me a small box. I opened it to find a brass nameplate that read HOA Board Member Harrison Cole. "I had it made for you. I know the board does not usually do nameplates, but I thought you should have something to commemorate your service. You have done more for this community in 1 year than I did in 5, she said. "That is not true, Patricia. You cared about this place. You just got a little lost in the rules." "We all do sometimes," I said. "Maybe. But you found your way and you helped the rest of us find ours too." "Thank you for that," she said. We hugged, a brief but genuine embrace, and then she left. I watched her walk out of the community center for the last time, heading toward a new chapter in her life. The following week, I installed the nameplate on my home office desk, right next to my computer monitor. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the journey that had brought me to this point. A simple bag of ice melt, a $300 fine, a woman slipping on icy steps, and a year of learning how to turn conflict into positive change. Spring arrived, bringing warmer weather and the usual tasks of yard maintenance and community cleanup days. I participated in everything, getting to know my neighbors better and strengthening the bonds that made Meadowbrook Estates feel like home. One Saturday in May, I was planting flowers in my front yard when a moving truck pulled up to the house that Patricia had lived in. A young couple got out, looking excited and a bit nervous as they directed the movers. I wiped the dirt off my hands and walked over to introduce myself. "Hi, I am Harrison Cole. I live down the street. Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, extending my hand. The man shook it enthusiastically. "Thanks. I am David and this is my wife, Emily. We are excited to be here. Great community. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to ask. I am on the HOA board so I can help with any administrative stuff too," I offered. Emily looked relieved. "Oh, good." We were a little worried about the HOA. We heard stories about the previous president being really strict. I laughed. Patricia was intense, but she meant well. Things have changed a lot in the past year. We try to be reasonable and work with people rather than against them. "That is good to hear," David said. "Also, pro tip, keep a few bags of ice melt on hand for winter. Michigan gets brutal and you will need it," I added with a grin. "Will do," David said, clearly not understanding the personal significance of that advice. Over the summer, I got to know David and Emily well. They were in their late 20s, both working in healthcare, and had bought the house as their first home. They dove into community life, attending events and volunteering for various projects. They represented the kind of homeowners that made neighborhoods thrive. Engaged, friendly, and willing to contribute. In July, the HOA organized a community garage sale. Dozens of families participated, setting up tables in their driveways and selling everything from old furniture to children's toys. It was a huge success, bringing in people from neighboring developments and creating a festive atmosphere. I set up my own table, selling various items I had finally sorted through when I organized my garage. Among the items was my old snow shovel, the one that had cracked and necessitated the trip to Home Depot that had started the whole ice melt saga. I had written "well-loved, battle-tested" on the price sticker as a joke. Gerald stopped by my table and picked up the shovel. "This thing looks like it has seen some serious action." "It has. That shovel and I cleared many a driveway together," I said nostalgically. "How much?" he asked. $5, but it comes with a story if you want to hear it," I said. "I think I already know the story," Gerald said with a laugh. "This is the shovel that started it all, is it not? The very one. It cracked during a big storm. I went to buy a new one, bought ice melt while I was there, and the rest is history," I confirmed. Gerald bought the shovel, saying he wanted it as a reminder that small things could lead to big changes. He mounted it on the wall in his garage like a trophy, which I found both hilarious and touching. As summer turned to fall, I reflected on how much my life had changed since moving to Meadowbrook Estates. What had initially seemed like just another suburban development had become a true community, one that I was proud to be part of. The ice melt incident, which could have left me bitter and resentful, had instead opened doors to meaningful involvement and positive change. The lessons I learned extended beyond HOA politics. I applied the same principles of communication, fairness, and finding common ground to my professional work and personal relationships. I became a better listener, more patient with different perspectives, and more willing to stand up for what I believed was right while remaining respectful of others. In October, I was invited to speak at a regional HOA conference about our community's transformation. I accepted, figuring that other HOAs might benefit from hearing about our experience. The conference was held in Grand Rapids, and about 200 people attended my session. I titled my presentation, "From Conflict to Community: How one violation notice changed everything. I walked through the ice melt incident, Patricia's accident, my appeal, and the subsequent reforms we had implemented. I emphasized the importance of treating homeowners with respect, maintaining perspective about what truly mattered, and being willing to admit when rules or processes were not working. The response was overwhelming. People lined up afterward to ask questions, share their own stories, and request copies of our revised guidelines. Several HOA board members told me they were going to propose similar reforms in their communities. One woman, who introduced herself as Linda from a development in Ann Arbor, was in tears. "Thank you so much for this presentation," she said. "My HOA fined me $500 because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black. I felt so powerless, but hearing your story gives me hope that I can fight it and maybe even change things." "You absolutely can," I assured her. "Document everything, present your case clearly and respectfully, and appeal to people's sense of fairness. Most board members are reasonable people. They just need someone to remind them of the human element." Linda thanked me again and left looking determined. I hoped she would succeed. When I returned to Meadowbrook Estates, Gerald told me that we had received several calls from other HOAs asking about our policies and procedures. Our little community had become something of a model for reasonable HOA governance, all because I had refused to accept an unjust fine for storing ice melt. November brought the first snow of the season. I was ready, with my garage now permanently organized to keep ice melt, shovels, and other winter supplies easily accessible. I treated my driveway and walkway, then walked around the neighborhood offering to help elderly residents with their snow removal. Several people took me up on it, and soon a small group of us were working together, clearing driveways and spreading ice melt for those who could not do it themselves. This became a regular practice throughout the winter. Whenever snow or ice hit, a group of volunteers would mobilize to help those who needed it. It was community in action, people taking care of each other rather than just focusing on their own properties. In December, at the holiday party, Gerald made a special announcement. The Regional HOA Association had recognized Meadowbrook Estates as Community of the Year for our innovative governance practices and high resident satisfaction. We were invited to accept the award at their annual gala in February. The room erupted in applause. People were genuinely proud of what we had built together. As I looked around at the smiling faces, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was why communities mattered. This was why it was worth fighting for fairness and reason over rigid rule enforcement. The board decided that we would all attend the gala together, along with any residents who wanted to come. We chartered a bus and made it into a community outing. About 40 people signed up, including David and Emily, Mrs. Chen, and several other neighbors I had come to know well. The gala was held at a fancy hotel in Detroit. We arrived in our chartered bus, a diverse group of suburban homeowners dressed in cocktails attire and ready to celebrate. The event organizers seemed surprised by how many of us had come, but they quickly set up additional seating at our table. When our award was announced, Gerald went up to accept it on behalf of the community. He gave a brief speech thanking everyone who had contributed to making Meadowbrook Estates a great place to live. Then, he did something unexpected. "I want to invite Harrison Cole to join me up here," Gerald said, gesturing toward our table. Harrison was the catalyst for the changes that earned us this recognition. He stood up to an unjust violation notice, appealed it successfully, and then joined the board to make sure others would not face similar situations. "Harrison, please come up and say a few words." I was not prepared for this, but I made my way to the stage. Gerald handed me the microphone. "Thank you," I began, my voice a bit shaky. "A little over a year ago, I got fined $300 for storing ice melt on my porch. I was frustrated and angry, and I seriously considered just paying it and moving on with my life. But something told me to fight it, not because I wanted to win, but because it was wrong. That decision led to a series of events that transformed our community." I paused, gathering my thoughts. The lesson I learned is that ordinary people have more power than they think. We do not have to accept unreasonable rules or unfair treatment. We can speak up, make our case, and work together to create positive change. But we also need to remember that the people enforcing those rules are human too. They make mistakes, they get stuck in patterns of thinking, and they can learn and grow. I looked out at the audience, seeing nods of agreement and some people wiping their eyes. Meadowbrook Estates is not perfect. No community is. But we are committed to treating each other with respect, finding reasonable solutions to problems, and remembering that homes are where people live their lives, not just properties to be managed. Thank you to everyone in our community who has embraced this approach, and thank you to the HOA Association for recognizing our efforts. The applause was loud and sustained. As I walked back to my seat, people I did not know stopped me to shake my hand or pat my back. It was one of those rare moments in life where you feel like you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing. The rest of the evening was a blur of celebration, good food, and dancing. Our group took over the dance floor, creating a party within the party. Mrs. Chen, who had to be at least 75, was out there dancing with surprising energy. David and Emily were leading conga lines. Even the typically reserved Robert was getting down to 80s pop music. On the bus ride home, people were tired but happy. Someone started singing old rock songs, and soon the whole bus had joined in. It was cheesy and wonderful, and exactly the kind of bonding experience that made communities strong. When we finally got back to Meadowbrook Estates, it was nearly midnight. People stumbled off the bus, calling out goodbyes and see you laters, heading to their respective homes. I walked the short distance to my house, breathing in the cold February air, and felt completely content. Inside, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat on my couch, the award plaque from the gala sitting on my coffee table. I picked it up and read the inscription. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA Community of the Year, recognizing excellence in governance and resident relations. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it. "Hi Harrison, this is Patricia. Gerald sent me a photo from the gala. Congratulations on the award. I am so proud of what you all have accomplished. You took my mistakes and turned them into something beautiful. Thank you." "Patricia," I replied. "Thank you, Patricia. None of this would have happened without your accident opening our eyes. Hope Florida is treating you well." She sent back a smiley face and a palm tree emoji. I sat there for a while longer, sipping my whiskey and thinking about the improbable chain of events that had led to this moment. If I had parked my truck in a different spot, I might have carried those ice melt bags straight to the garage. If Patricia had not done her inspection that evening, she might not have seen them. If she had issued a warning instead of an immediate fine, I might have just moved them without questioning anything. If she had not slipped on those icy steps, demonstrating the exact consequences of prioritizing appearance over safety, the board might not have been receptive to my appeal. So many small moments, any one of which could have gone differently and changed everything. But they had happened exactly as they did, creating a path from conflict to community, from anger to understanding, from rigid rule enforcement to compassionate governance. As winter gave way to spring once more, life in Meadowbrook Estates continued its peaceful rhythm. Gardens bloomed, children played in the streets, and neighbors chatted over fences. The HOA functioned smoothly in the background, handling necessary business without creating drama or imposing unreasonable burdens. I continued my work on the board for another year before deciding to step down. I had accomplished what I had set out to do, and it was time to let others bring their own perspectives and energy to community leadership. My replacement was Emily, the young woman who had moved into Patricia's old house. She had great ideas about sustainability and community engagement, and I knew she would do well. At my last board meeting, Gerald presented me with a framed photo from the night of the gala, showing our whole group on the bus, singing and laughing. Next to it was a smaller photo of 4 bags of ice melt stacked neatly on a porch. "So you never forget where it all started," Gerald said with a grin. I hung both photos in my home office, right above the nameplate Patricia had given me. They told a story of transformation, of standing up for what was right, and of the unexpected ways that small moments of conflict could become catalysts for positive change. Years later, when people asked me about my time on the HOA board, I would always start with the ice melt incident. Some people laughed at the absurdity of it. Others nodded knowingly, sharing their own HOA horror stories. But everyone understood the larger point, that communities were made of people, that rules should serve people rather than the other way around, and that sometimes the most ridiculous conflicts could teach the most important lessons. I still live in Meadowbrook Estates. My garage is still organized, with ice melt always readily accessible during winter months. Every year when the first snow falls, I think about that January day when I got fined for being prepared, and about the woman who slipped on icy steps the very next day because those steps had not been properly treated. The irony of it still makes me smile. But more than that, it reminds me that life has a way of teaching us lessons when we need them most, even if those lessons come wrapped in $300 fines and broken ankles. The neighborhood continues to thrive. New families move in, drawn by the reputation of reasonable governance and strong community bonds. Longtime residents stay because they feel valued and heard. The HOA remains a model for others, hosting regular tours and sharing our policies with communities across Michigan and beyond. And every winter, without fail, the community center steps are the first thing salted when ice threatens. It has become something of a tradition, a reminder of past mistakes and a commitment to never repeat them. That is the story of how I fought a $300 fine for storing ice melt, watched the HOA president, who issued that fine slip on her own icy steps the next day, and ended up transforming an entire community in the process. It was not the path I expected when I moved to Meadowbrook Estates, but it was exactly the path I needed. Sometimes life gives you ice melt and icy steps and impossible situations that force you to decide who you want to be and what kind of world you want to live in. I chose to fight, to stand up for fairness, and to work towards something better. And in doing so, I discovered that ordinary people in ordinary neighborhoods can create extraordinary change, one bag of ice melt at a time.